Hello everyone. Welcome to this week's live plant consciousness commentary. Yay! Woo! Um, so amazing to me every Friday that comes around. It's like, how did Friday get here so quick? I honestly, seriously, just am always shocked. But today I'm excited because, well, in addition to tons of amazing things, I mean, we had the Befriend Your Limiting Beliefs webinar in NCC yesterday, which was awesome. I'm not just speaking for myself, but hopefully others will tell you how amazing it was if you didn't go. The replay is in Sprout Discussions program/replay, so you can easily catch it there. I also just announced that Kickstart Your Limiting Beliefs Kickstart Your Conscious Revolution. It is about limiting beliefs and blocks, but Kickstart Your Conscious Revolution is going to be the 5th through the 9th of February inside of Blooming Sprouts. So if you're not a Blooming Sprout yet, now is your chance. If you join Blooming Sprouts right now, the whole thing is free. If you're in Blooming or in Flourishing, you're in, no worries, and go over there, go into the space, and you will see your I don't know if it's called, I guess it's pre-homework. That's what I've been calling it. I can't think of another name, but that's what it is. So we have lots of things coming up in the Naturally Conscious community in this period. I just had some amazing meetings today, actually this week, but today especially, I had some really, really, really great conversations with some new collaborators that I'm looking forward to kind of expanding our repertoire even more, bringing plant conversations in to new aspects of our own personal development. I've realized that yes, I love new material, but what I love more than anything is helping you integrate that material into your day-to-day life. And so that's where I'm going to put my focus. I'm going to put my focus into more activities and events and programs, and all about really the integration piece, the bringing it into day-to-day life, the really working with the plants super closely. So I'm putting out my Ipago Day launch kit. I've got so many things kind of set up. I'm getting myself nice and organized. Oh, it feels like a very productive week. I hope that your week has been productive. I hope that you're enjoying yourself. Today here we are going to continue on to our, we're going to continue and we're going to hopefully conclude our paper on conversations on plant sensing, notes from the field. This is Natasha Myers, who is a molecular biologist and also as well a PhD student. Well, actually, no, she has her PhD by this point, and she's also a dancer and a choreographer. So I'm really enjoying this paper. Is really about studying the phenomenon, or really understanding how plant sensing from a very broad perspective. It's ethnographic conversations, because that's one of the focuses of Natasha Myers. And she's working, really interviewing different molecular biologists and plant molecular biologists to try to understand. She's an anthropologist, a former plant scientist, and she's investigating really how plants sense in this entire paper. But what I like more than anything is that what she's realizing is that not just how plants perceive and respond to the environment, which I think is, what we would expect when you're talking about plant sensing, but she's coming into and examining the entanglement that comes from the relationship between the scientists and plants themselves, especially those types of relationships that the plant scientists themselves don't give themselves permission to explore, because, that's not within the confines of their work. And so what are the challenges in communicating this relationship in a way that still feels within the scientific paradigm? And I think that that's really what the essence of this entire, I don't know what it's called, paper and essay kind of things is. And really, how do we rethink the way of knowing or of relating to plants when we don't really have that vocabulary? And more importantly, how do we redefine the stories that we're telling by including the plants into it? So we went through about half of this in part one. So we got to about halfway through the paper. And so now we're just going to continue on. Hold on, let me share my screen with you so that you can see what we're talking about. Window, let's make this happen. So here is our paper, Conversations on Plant Sensing. It's very simple. I don't really exactly know where it was published, if in any place specifically, so that we can see it. Because right now all it is this plain old paper, but and it doesn't really say anything. So we are in the part of disenchantments. Who knows where we're going to go from here? But I'm actually excited. I have to say that this has been a very pleasant surprise, and I was left all week thinking about some of the different aspects, specifically, especially as a dancer, that really touched me because it resonated with the research methodology that I'm using right now for myself, and so I'm excited. Okay, so we're in disenchantments. If you remember, right when we left off where she was speaking to this I think it was a PhD student, Melissa, who was talking about her kind of relationship, but she didn't really know how to put it into words. She didn't know how to explain. And, you know, as you see here in the very end of it, she says, you know, this would really require researchers to cultivate different modes of attention, distinct lines of inquiry, and new ways of telling stories about what plants do and what plants know. What I learned from Melissa is that perhaps that is the place to begin conversations on plant sensing. Which yeah. So let's talk about disenchantments. I arrived early for my meeting with James, a postdoctoral fellow in Julia Maloff's plant shade laboratory at UC Davis. From what I understand, the people she's interviewing for this are both American laboratories as well as German. So I think that's another aspect that's really interesting to see what is the distinction and the difference between these two. I wandered down a long, gleaming white corridor that led to a series of plant science labs. The walls were remarkably bare, except for a few large posters from scientific meetings that detailed recent research. Oh, I remember that. I so remember that. These huge posters of like the paper or the patent, depending on what it was. A young woman with a slight build and short brown hair walked by me and gave me a curious look. No one just wanders the halls reading posters. I must be the anthropologist here to meet him. He directed me to his office at the end of the corridor. James is a recent PhD who made the move to UC Davis from Harvard to start postdoctoral research. He was there to extend his expertise in plant science by working on the topic of shade avoidance in tomato plants. Tomato plants. I'm still trying to figure out why the tomato plant decided that wanted to live with me. We're still working on it. I have a few ideas now that the tomato has told me, and yeah. Anyways, we're gonna get into that at some point, I promise you. He is from Caracas, Venezuela, and took a course during his baccalaureate. God, who calls it a baccalaureate? That led him from a world filled with monotonous greenery to a rich and varied landscape of diverse plant species that he learned how to name. He fell in love with plants. When he left Venezuela to study science at Cornell University, he specialized in computational and mathematical modeling. Yeah, because when I fell in love with plants, that's the first thing I think of. As a math geek, I have to say, though, I can understand it. Combining the life sciences with physics and computer science, plants fell into the background during that time, but when he started looking at grad school opportunities, plants again took center stage. At that time, he was a vegetarian and adverse to conducting experiments on laboratory animals. I know this is a conversation we have not had because it tends to get very political, but recently I have read a few, memes and single lines from certain big names that talk about the fact of like being a vegetarian, because how can you possibly kill animals? And as you could just imagine from my reaction, I find myself sometimes screaming at whatever device I'm looking at this on, whether it's a computer or, my phone or something, of like, I still am amazed that in 2024 now, we don't even think twice. Like, I am not saying that we should not kill plants. You know this. You know that I have this entire philosophy around this. I am still just surprised at the lack of the questioning. So I'm curious as to how do we get to the questioning that will allow us to arrive at a much more balanced and natural response. I am all for do not mistreat animals in the process of animal husbandry, but do not mistreat plants in, the course of agriculture. So yeah, anyways, that's another one of these like asides that at some point we're going to have to figure out how to tackle. I'd love to have an NCC type of conversation on this topic with a wide range of people, because I really want it to be broad and with nobody coming in with any kind of specific biases, neither myself nor anybody else. Okay. He was looking for a way to bridge together his interest in biomechanics with research at the nexus of evolutionary and developmental biology, a branch of research fondly nicknamed Evo-Devo. 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 That's a really good name for a band, Evo-Devo. Or Evo-Devo? Or is that too close to Devo? Anyway. He found a lab at Harvard specializing in orchid evolution and was captivated by a project on biomechanics of pollen dispersal in the genus Catasetum. I had arrived expecting to talk about shade avoidance mechanisms in tomato plants. I was surprised and delighted to meet an expert on a family of orchids that I had recently been researching for another project. As became clear in our interview, James is a fan of Darwin, and he and Darwin share a love of orchids. I had recently been reading Darwin's accounts of his orchid pollination experiments, including those he had conducted on Catasetum orchids. In a letter to J.D. Hooker on October 13, 1861, Darwin confided, "I never was more interested in my life in any subject than this of orchids." He was particularly in awe of stories he had heard about the propulsive power of male Catasetum flowers, which, it was said, could fling their pollen sacs at visiting bees with magnificent force and simultaneously eject a long stream of glue that would ensure the pollinarium would stick to the body of the insect. Can you just imagine? Sorry, I just had an image come through my head. Can you just imagine? I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a somewhat PG rated way. But can you just imagine, even in the case of consensual adults that have chosen to procreate together, like just flinging your pollen sacs and ejecting a long stream of glue specifically to ensure, I mean, I guess, okay, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to stop. Sorry, I'm going to compose myself because now I'm asking all kinds of actually really natural questions, but they're going to take me down another route. So I'm just not even going to go there. In an earlier letter to J.D. Hooker, and then of course we add the word hooker into it, and it's like, okay, on June 9th, 1861, Darwin had detailed all of the British orchids he had examined and exclaimed, "I shall never rest till I see a catasetum of eject pollen masses." Less than a... Thank you, Paul, for feeling my funny bone. Okay. Less than a year later, he received some Catasetum species by post and conducted an extensive series of experiments in his home laboratory. He learned a great deal about the sensitivity of the trigger mechanism in the male flower and enabled it to propel its pollinarium with such force at visiting insects. He reported, "Several persons have told me that when touching the flowers of this genus in their hothouses, the pollinia have struck their faces. I touched the antenna of C. colossum whilst holding the flower at about a yard's distance from the window, and the pollinarium hit the pane of glass and adhered to the smooth vertical surface by its adhesive disc." So bizarre was this phenomenon that his attempts to relay his findings to his friend, T.H. Huxley, were met... Stop it, Michelle, stop. It's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. Okay, sorry, I'm going to attempt to be an adult in all this. I'm going to attempt to be an adult. I carefully described to Huxley the shooting of the pollinarium in Catasetum and received for an answer, Do you really think I can believe all that? James opened the second chapter of his dissertation with that very quote. It seems to capture both his and Darwin's awe and wonder over these marvelous plants. I can just imagine the professors going back to do the sorry, okay. I will compose myself. Let me take a drink here. It is just tea. Cold tea now, with some spirulina in it. During our conversation, James told me awesome, crazy, and uncanny stories about the ways that, as he put it, the reproductive biology of the bees is intermingled with the reproductive biology of the orchid. Cross-cultural love, man. Cross-cultural love. He told me a story about an Australian plant, the hammer orchid. Seriously, they're just trying to kill me today. They're trying to kill me. The hammer orchid, known to perform an astonishing form of mimicry that can deceive male thynine wasps into thinking that its flower is a female wasp. That's no good. These wasps can, I'm going to give you something that I hadn't thought about before. I'm just going to throw it out there. You know how my mind works. So you've been here a while. And if you're new, just so you know, I just think weird. Okay, I think weird. So in a lot of these things, when we talk about mimicry, for example, here we assume that because the flower looks like the female wasp, the plant is trying to deceive the wasp. But I'm going to throw out another thought, which is, what if in reality, the flower saw just how successful the female wasp is and didn't try to trick the wasp into thinking, but really just tried to make the wasp like Key? I mean, it's possible, right? We don't know what they're thinking. Maybe this is Key's way of like, you know how when you like somebody, and then you see that they like this type and you just try to make yourself, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I'm just wondering, is it deceive? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to let you roll with that one. Today is one of those days. These plants can, with incredible accuracy, synthesize bouquets of volatile chemicals that mimic the pheromones of their pollinators. Male wasps are especially attracted to these chemical bouquets, and they can be observed attempting to copulate with the flowers. Pseudo-copulation names the form of mimicry through which a male wasp mistakes a flower for a mate. I don't know. Maybe he's just trying to get into a relationship with the flower that has no strings. It's possible, right? If it's a wasp that the wasp mates with, there could be strings attached. Maybe this is trans-cubed, transgender, trans-species, trans-kingdom relationship. I love it, Paul. I love it. Okay. What is so amazing about the pseudocopulation mechanism is that they've evolved clearly many, many times in the Orchidaceae. And you see them in Ophrys, a large family of Orchidaceae, and you see them in the really awesome Australian orchid, Dracea, or hammer orchid. These orchids are pollinated by thynine wasps, which have a sort of pre-copulatory behavior. The male takes females for a nuptial flight. And so they grab onto the orchid, which has this scent. And if you look in this particular case, the Australian orchid, if you look at it on a gas chromatography and mass spectrometry instrument, the chemical profile of the flower scent is practically identical to the pheromones of the female. So it's just uncanny, right? The bee is grabbing onto the labellum of the orchid, trying to make off with it for its nuptial flight, and it can't because the flower is attached to the plant. And the labellum is hinged at the bottom. When the wasp tries to fly off with a lot of force, what it ends up doing, because of the hinge, is that it ends up butting its head against the column, the reproductive parts of the orchid, until it finally gets the pollinarium attached to it. I see, if we were to have movies of this type of stuff, we could totally introduce the world to the world of plants and the intelligence of plants. How can you see this and not think that this is cunning and super intelligent behavior? Serious, it's cunning. It's cunning. It's cunning. James' story was full of enchantment and excitement at the discovery that the sensory dexterities of plants and insects were so intricately entangled. He used the term uncanny a couple of times in our interview to express his fascination and near disbelief that these relations between plants and insects could have ever evolved. It's kind of a crime, right, Michelle? Michelle, it's kind of a crime. I agree. I mean, there goes the question of intent. Did the orchid really know that they weren't a wasp? Or were they just mimicking the wasp because they wanted to be like the wasp? Did the wasp, the male wasp, really not know that it was a flower? Or was it a tree? These are so... Sorry, I was relieved to hear so much awe in his voice. The literature on insect pollination and orchids I was reading was remarkably devoid of such sentiments. It is as if this wonder is stifled when scientists confront the conventions of scientific writing and publish their findings. We have seen this. We have seen this. You know, I don't know if you know this, but I watch a lot of like LawTube, like YouTube around lawyers and things that are happening in the law world, especially in the United States. And there's a lot of briefs, you know, the briefs that you give to the court. I read a lot of those. And sorry, I just saw Michelle's comment. I'll mention in a second. But in there's a lot of sass. There's a lot of like undertones and a lot of like kind of sassy comments, where the world of scientific writing, I think, could benefit from the sass. And I agree with Michelle, we need a botanical SVU, a special victims unit, right? This is Law and Order Plant Edition SVU. I think we would have a lot of things to, actually, if we just had a plant edition, I think we would discover that there's just a lot of cunning stuff. It's not just uncanny, it's literally cunning. It's a little like subversive. I mean, there's just a lot. I made a couple of attempts to bring this issue up with James. I wanted to ask him why it is when researchers publish their accounts, they remove all reference to the plants of active agents. We know the plants are active agents in this, actively choosing this path. I wanted to understand how and why pleasure, play, improvisation, and creativity are elided in the textual conventions of plant and animal behavior. I don't know. I think that they allow a lot more of it in the animal behavior, especially in certain animals. Like maybe we won't allow it as much in fish, but we definitely would in certain kinds of mammals. But I agree, it's completely devoid. If we were going back to some of the papers that we've read together about plant intelligence, and we added exactly these types of accounts with that kind of enthusiasm and awe and wonder, I think it would be much easier to actually see the intelligence and the directed and the play behavior. Mancuso used to talk about this a lot, especially around play and improvisation, more of improvisation in the perspective of really using your environment, of improvising whatever it is that you have. I have a Diplandia now plant that I built this entire sort of monkey bar set for, like these like hanging chains for, and it's amazing every day to watch how Diplandia is starting to like go through the chains and then circumnavigate in order to find the next place and intertwine. And it's play, it's improvisation, it is creativity to discover where they can actually, he can actually hook in. It's amazing. His response was telling. I think it is largely this skeptical attitude of scientists that we don't know if they have agency or not. So we're not going to ascribe any. Frankly, the jury is still obviously out on that. Is it? But is it really out? I don't know if it's out. I think it's out in some people's minds, but I think we have more than enough to say it's not really out. The jury has come back and has rendered a verdict. Plants are agents. They are aware. Anyway, not going to go there. Frankly, the jury is still obviously out on that, particularly in the case of mammals, which are quite intelligent. Non-human mammals are quite intelligent, like apes. And I am not an animal behavioral scientist, but he admitted that his reluctance to ascribe agency to any organisms is part of the scientific ethos. Yes, and we need to change that ethos. That is a paradigm that needs to shift. That requires investigators to maintain skepticism with regard to things they do not or cannot know. Again, really? Can we not know? Really? Though he wavered on non-human mammals, this ethos refuses to grant the capacity for awareness or even minimal sentience to other organisms. This is the reason why Paco Calvo's lab, remember Paco Calvo, we read his book, Planta Sapiens, and we've read many, many of his papers here. That's why he called his laboratory MINT, the Minimal Intelligence Lab, because all he could say was just to ascribe, the only place he felt like he could get to a base common denominator was minimal intelligence. Like he didn't feel like he could, in his scientific world, completely commit to major intelligence, just minimal. James' assertion didn't do much to shake my conviction that the ethos of skepticism is bound up with a kind of refusal to inquire. You go, girl. Yes. A studied ignorance that in effect enforces a domain of non-knowledge around the capacities of non-human life. It's almost as if, okay, I'm going to use an example. Women, you know this. It's like when a woman says something really technical that is new and innovative, and everybody sort of asks for proof, and like you have to like really get into it, and you have to cite all your sources, and you have to give all of this information, and you have to and then a man comes in and makes an assertion, and everybody's like, wow, that's amazing. I don't think it happens as much now, by the way, but it definitely used to happen that way. And I think that's what's happening here. We're double and triple and quadruple checking whether or not plants are really intelligent and other non-humans. And then we're making it extra hard on ourselves, which I understand we don't want to have biases, but sometimes it's useful to start with the premise that it is that way and see where it goes. Maybe in the end, you'll discover that it's not, but you need to like play it both ways. You can't just always keep putting more and more roadblocks between being able to assert that a plant is intelligent. You need to kind of look at it from multiple angles. Let's look at it as if the plant was intelligent. What are the behaviors that tell us that? Let's look at it as if plants were not intelligent. What is the behaviors of that? Let's look at it as if we don't know. How can we ascribe this? Like, if we don't start to really look at the crystal from every side, we will never get to a definitive answer. You can't just continue to push uphill from one direction. Truth doesn't work that way. The outcome of this attitude in practice is the reinforcement of a boundary between human and non-humans and bolsters an exceptionalism toward human capacities and agencies. Yes, agreed. Anthropologist David Graeber has taken up this issue of human exceptionalism in the behavioral sciences, troubling the ways researchers tend to approach the phenomenon of animal play. He asks, why do animals play? Well, why shouldn't they? The real question, why does the existence of action carried out for the sheer pleasure of acting, the exertion of powers for the sheer pleasure of exerting them, strike us as mysterious? See, that's exactly what I'm saying. He's applying it. Yes, we can sometimes ask, why do animals play? But we need to equally ask, well, why shouldn't animals play? And the same thing for plants. Stefano Mancuso has a video he loves to show based on research that he did in his laboratory, where you have sunflower seeds growing together, playing, in his opinion. He says this is the way that those plants socialize themselves, so much so that a plant that was raised in a single seed by themselves, when placed with other plants after the plant has now sprouted and grown, does not behave the same way. And in his opinion, it's because the socialization was lacking, the play time, the ability to just exert yourself and to interact with others for the sheer sake of interacting with others. And this is a really interesting concept. But if we don't allow ourselves for a second to suspend our disbelief and approach the problem from the, oh, look, this behavior looks like animal play, let me follow the thread of, what if this is animal play? How do we get to an understanding? What does it tell us about ourselves that we instinctively assume that it is? In our conversations, In our conversations, I told James that I was interested in the ways that the scientific literature on plant-insect encounters polices pleasure. I relate a story, botanical SUV, there you are, SVU, excuse me, SVU, there we are, polices pleasure. I relate a story about how one researcher in a scientific paper on Ophrys, insect mimicry, felt compelled to assure his readers that the male bees can actually discriminate between the flowers and their female mates. Though the bees do get aroused, Nielsen insisted that ejaculation does not occur at flowers. Just enough rather than full sexual incitement is at play, a level that prevents pollinator exhaustion and sperm loss. The message, don't worry, dear reader, the bees are not wasting their precious sperm on non-viable sexual encounters. Please do not allow me to extrapolate that to humans and other, anyway. I am holding back a lot of my thoughts about provincialism and so many other things. Indeed, bee and plant behaviors must not breach the dictates of efficiency in what this literature figures as an energetic economy governing reproductive strategies. Yes, Michelle, I bet you did have a male audience. Ophrys mimicry must not be too effective. Were the orchids to trick all male bees, the orchids would outcompete female bees for mates, and the orchid pollinator populations would decline. Nielsen's worry is grounded in some of the core assumptions that guide evolutionary storytelling in this field. I did not find the words or space in the conversation with James to explain my concern with heteronormativity of this account of compulsory and efficient sexual reproduction. That is a beautiful line. Indeed, such anxieties about sperm loss seem to me out of place in an effectively charged space of this undeniably queer interspecies sex act that involves plants luring wasps into intimate contact. We have done a paper on queer nature, and I think that we're going to do more of them because I think I need to go look up some of the literature because this is a great topic. You know, going back to Paul's trans-cube, transgender, trans-species, trans-kingdom, right? This is a really important aspect that I think, again, going back to multiple facets of truth, allows us to relook at ourselves as animal species, because we are an animal species as human beings. And it allows us to liberate ourselves from some of the conditioned labels and to look at ourselves as a being of nature and say, how do I interact with the world as a being of nature? And what is quote unquote acceptable to me as a being of nature? Not acceptable, that's not the right word. What is possible? Maybe? I'll let you help me find the right word. What I found so, hold on, sorry. What I found so troubling about the rendering of plant-insect encounters was its refusal to entertain the possibility that the male bees might not just be dupes falling for a sexual swindle. Exactly. Didn't I just say that like 2 pages ago? Could it be that the bees were pleasuring themselves and perhaps more to the point, pleasuring the flowers? I love this woman. I love her. Plants and flower tissue are, after all, incredibly sensitive to touch and tactile stimuli. Is this a form of wasp masturbation? Is it a form of like trans-kingdom relationships or inter-kingdom relationships? Recent studies attest to the importance of the microstructures of orchid petals and their colorful displays and suggest that these features may entice males to indulge in the pleasures of pseudo-copulation. Again, no strings attached, man. Strings attached. Fumbling with words, I found myself at the limits of language trying to communicate these ideas to James. His response to my rather cumbersome intervention spoke volumes. Non-scientists have interesting, very anthropomorphic responses to these natural systems, but it's just a bit of 5th grade sometimes. Then I am stuck in 5th grade. But I think that the 5th grade allows us to get out of the university level limitations of our thought processes. So I'm going with the 5th grader, man. I think the 5th grader sees the world a little bit more clearly when it comes to these things. I'll let you think about it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Put them in the chat. I want to know what you're thinking. Ascribing too much agency to the plants and their desires rendered my intervention childish and therefore moot. Screw you. Sorry. This is a familiar move. The charge of childishness or immaturity is a common among those who police against anthropomorphism in scientific discourse. But going back to what she said last week, right? When we did the first part of this paper is, yes, we do not want to anthropomorphize plants completely, but we also have to remember that we humans are animals, right? So while I think the anthropomorphism of, I see a face in that plant is too much, and ascribing certain tendencies that go too far. But instead, if we think about human processes, things that for us are quote unquote natural, like masturbation, right? It is a natural thing. Even 5th graders masturbate, right? Like I don't know if it's 5th graders. Sorry for parents. I'm not a parent, so I don't know at what age, and I don't remember. But you touch yourself, you're curious, you play doctor, and all these types of things that happen. That's how we've learned to express ourselves. Why is it unthinkable that a plant or an animal, again, we're all nature, why is it unthinkable to think that kin also experience that? It's not unthinkable. That's not anthropomorphism. We're not saying they are masturbating. We're opening to the curiosity of the possibilities to explore this topic. And I think this is really interesting. Here, I get called out as a rather naughty little kid who does not yet have a handle on the function of sex. It's also functional in the natural world. Like there's no pleasure in it, which is total baloney when you really look at animal species. They're probably plant species. I am amused, but also frustrated by how hard it is. I think there's a 2 missing there. To talk about these things and still get taken seriously. I can feel the constraints on permissible and impermissible ways of speaking about organisms in the pauses and prevarications and elisions of my own speech. This was not an issue James and I could work out in the course of our first meeting, but it was a crucial moment for me, one where I could begin to think through the politics of anthropomorphism in plant sciences. What I learned in this space was to think more carefully about where James, a postdoctoral fellow, was positioned in this conversation. Whereas Stacy, a well-recognized expert in her field, did not seem troubled by the invocation of terms like memory and anticipation during our conversation. James did not have the same stature or experience. James' advisor, Julian Maloff, also a respected and well-known scientist, was, like Stacy, not so concerned with imputing behavior to plants. He referred to the ways that tomato plants avoid shading their own and others' leaves as part of their foraging behavior. One could say that shade avoidance enables these plants to eat more sunlight. He thought it was fair to apply animal behavioral models to plants. It's the same thing happening at a different speed, he explained, where animals respond by movement, plants respond by growing, which is a form of movement, right? So if Stacy and Julian, could talk to me about plant behaviors in these ways, why was James so concerned? Why was he so careful with anthropomorphisms in our conversation? Are there perhaps different consequences for a more junior scientist vying for recognition in the field? My conversations with Melissa helped me understand this predicament better. Anthropomorphism meets phytomorphism. I like that word. Over the course of her time in the lab, Melissa's research project changed significantly. Snags, unexpected challenges, and underwhelming results have kept her shifting between projects. She was in the midst of describing her current research project when our conversation swerved. She was telling me about a new phenotype she was observing in her plants that carry mutations in 4 circadian clock genes. The leaves of this plant were extraordinarily large. It was her job to figure out why. Was it because the mutations in the circadian clock made the plant process starch and sugar differently? She offered up one tentative hypothesis that she is considering pursuing in the lab. And so where the plant, is normally storing starch during the day through photosynthesis and then mobilizing throughout the night, maybe the process is confused, if you will, as if the plant is just mobilizing sugars when it shouldn't be. She ended her description with this caveat. Well, that is really anthropomorphizing it. Anthropomorphism? Right. I had already heard several graduate students insert scare quotes around concepts, warning me that they were breaking the rules and anthropomorphizing the plants. I didn't skip a beat in my response. Okay, now say that for me in a non-anthropomorphic way. Tell me again what you were just saying, but this time try not to anthropomorphize it. I wanted to know the difference it would make in her account. How would the grammar change? Melissa hesitated for a moment. Let me see. The time of day of starch degradation or the regulation of starch degradation is altered or is affected. In her second rendition, the plant becomes a body that can be affected, but it does not have the power to affect its behavior. In other words, what she's saying is that in the moment that you ascribe, in the perspective of these younger, more junior scientists, it seems like, in the moment that you ascribe agency through the actions that you are describing that the plant is doing, you feel like you're going towards anthropomorphization, say that 3 times fast, and you are slapping yourself because you feel like your research is not going to be accepted because of it. But again, that is potentially rendering plants as objects when they shouldn't be, because you're afraid that the behaviors that you're seeing in their description prove agency. It's an Ouroboros, man. It's a snake biting its own tail. I pointed out that the main difference I could hear between the statements was that she posed the second version in the passive voice. In other words, yes, this happens, but nobody is doing it. It was no longer the plant mobilizing the sugars, rather it was a process happening to the plants. She agreed. She didn't want to be heard implying that the plant was deciding what it would do. But of course it does. Or that there was any intention in the plant. And again, state what you see. You can even put a caveat that says, while it is clear that the plant is carrying out this action, it is unclear whether this is a conscious or an unconscious act. Even say it that way, right? Give yourself that space to say it. But let's not deny the fact that the plant is experiencing it. It was clear that it took some effort for her to articulate this process without ascribing any agency. Read ahead, Tig. Read ahead, Tigria. Her caution and care, heard in the pauses, lesions, and prevarications of her speech, remind me of my own faltering articulations of plant agency in my conversation with James. As I learned in my long-term study of structural biology, pedagogical contexts are seen as particularly risky spaces for propagating anthropomorphisms. Instructors are particularly wary of the effects of anthropomorphisms on student understandings of molecular processes. But we're talking about sentient beings. It's impossible. That's not anthropomorphism. That's not making it human. That's saying these are sentient beings. Why is that so hard? They are often much more careful about how they frame their stories and when they are working with their students. And the students themselves are thus often more cautious about how they use their language than their expert mentors. And yet, as I observed so frequently ethnographic research among a wide range of scientists, experts will anthropomorphize wildly, unabashedly, and without qualification. I tell Melissa a bit of my research on anthropomorphism. I spent all this time with structural biologists who in their pedagogy with their undergraduates were really cautious about how they talked about their proteins. But when they talk amongst themselves, they say things like, my molecule wants to do this. Melissa laughs in recognition. She used to work in a protein biochemistry lab and is familiar with the way people anthropomorphize their proteins. Playfully, we act out the anthropomorphisms that run rampant in the lab. Right, Melissa confirms. He, the protein, feels like he doesn't want to be degraded right now. I respond, oh, he's so happy. How do I make my protein happy? This shared acknowledgement shifts thinking for Melissa. That's a really interesting point, she confirms. It's how we talk in the lab, like the protein crystallographers, crystallographers I interviewed. Melissa acknowledged that she and her lab mates worry whether their plants are happy or unhappy, what they like or don't like. Because of course, maybe happiness doesn't feel like it does for us and jittery and whatever, but that doesn't mean that a plant is not like enjoying in whatever way the plant would enjoy really beautiful day of sun or a delicious drink of water when they're thirsty. I mean, seriously, why wouldn't they? Again, kin are sentient. In the midst of our conversation, James also admitted that it's common for him and his colleagues to fall back on anthropomorphisms as a kind of shorthand. I shared with James my experience working with structural biologists who constrained their accounts for their students, but talk amongst themselves as if molecules were wily and desiring. Like Melissa, he was quick to confirm. Right, because amongst experts, it's easier and you're not trying to be judged. A lot of my background is in phylogenetics, so I am very, very careful not to say primitive or advanced. I don't say basal. I say it's an ever-diverging lineage. But when I'm talking to my peers, I'm much less strict with the language because they're not going to judge me. And they know what I'm talking about. And they know that I am not ascribing directionality or, especially the terms primitive and advanced. They are extremely loaded. I am quick to laud James for his caution around the use of progressive language to describe evolutionary processes. After all, the effects of such metaphors have long plagued the history of anthropology, and anthropologists have spent considerable effort calling attention to the problems of such rhetoric in the human sciences. But are all anthropomorphisms so problematic? I wondered if James was being overly cautious. But then I had to remember that he and Melissa are both junior scientists, still learning the tacit and explicit rules that condition the thought collective that constitutes their respective fields. A lot is at stake for them, and the risks are high. While their advisors have secure jobs and solid standing in the field, aka tenure, I can understand why these researchers feel compelled to toe the line. They are not yet in a position to acknowledge the productivity of anthropomorphisms in their own thinking. And so for them, it can only be a trap. Subjecting themselves to the charge of anthropomorphism is not a risk they are willing to take. They put a lot of effort into disciplining themselves and their ethnographer so that they are heard correctly. Back in the conference room, I try to push Melissa to think with me on the implications of anthropomorphism. So what do you think the dangers are? What are the risks in talking about plants' intentions and desires? Her response brought us back to Michael Pollan. Melissa says, it goes back to what I was saying earlier with the Pollan article. It speaks to us. It helps us understand because we're thinking of it in a way that we know. But plants are not lesser us. They are very different from us. They are their own entities. And I love this particular paragraph because I think there is a difference between acknowledging intentions and desires and making those intentions and desires the same as human intentions and desires. And I think that this is the real crux of this entire paper, which is that how do we get to a place where we talk about the fact that plants have maybe intentions, desires, feelings, but they are not human intention, desires, and feelings. And this is something I've been talking about for a long time now. I've really been thinking a lot about what does a plant emotion look like? Just like we kind of think we even understand human emotions, but reality is we don't. We just think we do. We all experience a form of happy and we just assume that that happy is the same happy for everyone. But is it really the same happy for everyone? We don't know. The only way you know is by having conversations. Today I was talking to a colleague, a Dominhurian initiate, and somebody who also works in like the training and coaching. She does cultural diversity. And we were talking about how hard it is for us to observe without ascribing intent to the observations when we see people talking, for example. And those intentions that we ascribe come from our cultural baggage. If I'm in the United States and two people are talking and they're not smiling, I might think it's a serious conversation and it's something really, something that is that need to be taken with a lot of solemnness and things like that. Where if I'm Russian, that could be a totally normal conversation, like two people who just met and are getting to know each other, and there's nothing heavy about the conversation at all. Cultural differences change the way that we interpret things. So when we talk about intentions and desires with plants, I don't see that there's a problem. And I get where Natasha Myers is trying to get to, which is it is not the fact of using the idea that plants might have intentions and desires. Our problem is on the other side, that we ascribe those intentions and desires with human-based emotions rather than giving ourselves permission to explore what the intentions and desires mean for the plants. Melissa wants us to be able to think about plants from a plant's perspective. Agreed, 100%. One not already biased by what we value in humans. Later in the conversation, I bring up the issue of plant neurobiology again. I tell Melissa how excited I am to meet a researcher who's working on plasmodesmata. I tentatively reveal my speculative fabulation that this may be plasmodesmata turn the whole plant into a giant nerve. It's not like plants have nerves, and of course a nerve doesn't feel on its own without a brain. But perhaps there is a system of connectivity that allows us to make the analogy. Melissa still pushes back in a way that teaches me new things about the kinds of human exceptionalism that these plant researchers are trying to work athwart. Again, she insists, I think it cheapens plants. I ask her, and this is the cheapens plants is something that, what's his name? Michael Martyr talks about this a lot. He is also somebody who goes down the path of saying that when we try to relate plant physiology in particular by trying to make it fit into some type of human model, such as a nerve or a neuron or any of these types of things, nerves and neurons and all these pieces were developed by humans in order to be interpreted by the brain, right? It's an entire system. Yes, you can sort of use the analogy that there is a system of thinking and therefore whatever, but once, if I interpret Martyr correctly, once you start getting into the sort of specifics and you start to make specific analogies, he's like, you cheapen the entire system. Plants have developed a completely different and very sophisticated system. Why can't we go to give that names and say, yes, all of this is thinking and feeling and experiencing. Those are common among both because plants, they're aware and they feel and they think about things and they experience them in their own way, but it is not through nerves and neurons, which is how humans have developed to do it. And I think it is a very advanced conversation that should be had. I think it is a useful conversation, but it's very advanced. I think we're still at the place of trying to agree with the terms of just plants think. They think. How can we get people to understand that plants think? We don't know how they think or what they think, but we know that they think because they have to make decisions. To make a decision, you have to think. I ask her to say more. It assumes that we are the ultimate being, she explains. Rather than deploying humans as a measure of plants, she wants us to see what would happen if we set plants as the measure of human capacities. So, she asks, what is the analogy we are making for our chemistry and the amazing secondary metabolism that we don't have, and the caffeine that we don't make? These products that plants make that heal or defend, these are skills we don't have. She reminds me of Dorian Sagan's rant against human exceptionalism in a recent talk that lauded plants as metabolically superior. It's a very interesting concept. I like this. This is an interesting concept to me. To humans and animals. We think we're so great, he chided as his audience, what with our animal capacity to harness the power of mitochondria, those latter-day bacteria, which enable the slow combustion of food molecules using atmospheric oxygen. Well, plants are even better, he insisted. They have both chloroplasts and mitochondria. We learned in grade school that plants produce oxygen that we breathe and breathe carbon dioxide that we exhale, suggesting an essential equivalence and the nice ecological match between plants and animals. But plants not only photosynthesize, producing oxygen, they also use oxygen just like we do. They use it at night when sunlight is not available as a source of energy. They can do this because they also incorporate those former respiring bacteria, the mitochondria, into the cell. Maybe aliens have detected life on Earth, but considering us parasites have decided to communicate directly and chemically with plants, are metabolic superiors. And this is true, right? We forget that plants don't need us. We need them. We need kin. They're just fine. Kin are just fine without us. Like Sagan, Melissa insisted that if you want to study chemistry, you should study plants. Plants are masters of chemical synthesis. Instead of measuring plant intelligence up against human intelligence, a contest that will always render plants lesser us, then perhaps we should consider comparing our capacities to plants' remarkable skills at chemical engineering. So maybe it has to go both ways. That would be a little bit better if we went both ways. What's our homologous processes to secondary metabolism? If it goes that way, it needs to go the other way too. I agree. Nice. Yeah. But maybe then I'd feel more comfortable about that. But who wants to talk about that? All the things like secondary metabolism and photosynthesis that we don't do. Exactly. We definitely do not see photosynthesis for the amazing thing that it is. I can take energy straight from the sun and just turn it into food. Like, we humans can't do that. I was taken by her response, though I could see how easy it is for people to get caught up in contests that pit species and kingdoms against one another. In a larger ecological frame, such competitions seem quite beside the point. However, her insistence on asking, what is our homologous process, reminded me of how our analogies move in unpredictable ways. Indeed, I had recently been learning that anthropomorphism does not operate in one direction. This conversation with Melissa reminded me of Darwin's research with orchids. Reading through Darwin's orchid pollination experiments a couple of years earlier, I had come across a striking passage reproduced below. Here, Darwin is attempting to communicate to his readers the precise form of several different species of catasetum. The position of the antennae in his catasetum may be compared with that of a man with his left arm raised and bent so that his hand stands in front of his chest. Wait, his left arm raised and bent so that his hand stands in front of his chest. Huh? Is that what he's saying? And with his right arm crossing his body lower down so that the fingers project just below his left side. In catasetum callosum, both arms are held lower down and are extended symmetrically. In C. saccatum, the left arm is bowed and held in front, as in C. tridentatum, but rather lower down, while the right arm hangs downwards, paralyzed, with the hand turned a little outwards. In every case, notice will be given in an admirable manner. When an insect visits the labellum and the time has arrived for the ejection of the pollinium, so that it may be transported to the female plant. On first reading, the statement appears like any other anthropomorphism that likens a plant in some ways to a man. But consider what it took for Darwin to make the analogy. Would he have not had to move his own body to figure out the distinctive forms of each plant? Here, Darwin can be seen enacting a body experiment, a kinesthetically and effectively charged twist of the often countered thought experiment. In effect, he demonstrates just how he has entrained his own body to the specificities of floral form. Darwin shows his readers how he is mimetically entangled with the orchids. Willing to be moved by the plant form, his human bodily contours are decentered and displaced in the same moment that he reinscribes those of the orchids. Thus, what might initially be seen as a one-way imposition of human qualities on the plants can, on a second glance, be read as a multi-directional process that generates infoldings in thought and in relation. That's really interesting. I'm going to have to think about that one because I like it. It kind of goes to what she was saying in the first half, where she was talking about her own journey by understanding tropism through her own bodily movements. It's not her trying to make the plant be like her, it's her trying to become like the plant. And therefore, it's a different direction. I'm going to think on that. Darwin's example helps me understand that what we call anthropomorphism may actually be evidence of our capacity and willingness to open ourselves to others, to let other modes of embodiment inflect and transform our own. I told Melissa about the protein modelers I had been working over the past 10 years, whose body experiments are resonant with Darwin's. I described how they would frequently animate and anthropomorphize their molecules as wildly desiring creatures. Close attention to their painstaking efforts to build atomic resolution models of molecular structures taught me how they continually refined their understanding of molecular forms and movements. I explained how I saw this as a process of attunement that enables modelers to become responsive to the subtleties of molecular energies and movements. It was by giving themselves over to the labor of making models and animations that modelers learned how to move with and be moved by molecular phenomena. In the process, they allowed their bodies to be inhabited by their models. They drew on this embodied knowledge to make hypotheses about how molecules would move and interact. In the process, they situated themselves inside the molecular phenomenon in order to reach toward insight. Molecular phenomena set their bodies into motion, and in the process, they became proxies for their molecules. Indeed, I explained, protein modelers not only anthropomorphized their molecules, they also got molecularized in the process. Molecularmorphized? I don't know if that's a word, but that's very interesting. And that goes to what I was saying before. I think that there is a two-way if we allow it. This is really helping me rethink also anthropomorphization. Melissa was thrilled. These people have been molecularized. Ah, right. And I elaborated. These researchers have been so transformed in their intimate encounters with molecules. They learn to move their bodies around like molecules. And so perhaps there's a kind of plantification of the human scientist going on in the plant labs. You mean kind of like the emergence of their vegetality or their plantness? Ah, yeah. That's a really, really good point. So Natasha says, so I think anthropomorphism isn't a one-way thing. There's an openness. And I think the scientists are going to teach us about what it means to actually be taken into another world by another organism. That organism is going to teach us new things. I think it is wonderful when you say, what is a homologous process and who are we to think that we are the ultimate being? There can be something so humble about scientific inquiry. Melissa, it takes a level of open-mindedness, maybe, Natasha, and maybe one day you will be plantified. You will embody your plantedness. I think it's time to plant another I am plant. And we might include movement in this. I think that's going to be a necessary piece. Melissa, if I am not already, yes, you probably are plantified, dear. You all probably are. I think back to this conversation with Melissa during a visit to Ian Baldwin's laboratory and his Institute for Chemical. Wait, hold on. I just realized I'm on page 25. Where am I? Oh, okay, I'm almost done. All right, folks, we're almost done because this finishes on page 28 and we're on page 25. And we're actually far off. We're down at the bottom. I think back to this conversation with Melissa during a visit to Ian Baldwin's laboratory at the Institute for Chemical Ecology at the Max Planck in Jena, Germany. I told you she went to Germany a few months later. There, I encountered a new term for the phenomenon I had been calling plantification or vegetalization. Ian, an American scientist who took up the post in Germany 17 years ago, runs a massive laboratory with over 70 graduate students, postdocs, and staff dedicated to the study of chemical ecology of wild tobacco. Thank God they're using wild. Thank you, goddess. His group examines of a range of chemicals that this plant synthesizes to lure pollinators, deflect predators, and communicate with other plants and animals in the environment. Over dinner in a traditional Thuringian restaurant in Jena, Ian explains that he is not concerned with anthropomorphism. Rather, when he is training his students, he gets them to phytomorphize. Yes. According to him, this is the best way for his students to get inside the problems that plants encounter in their environments. He wants his students to be able to morph their bodies in such a way that they can begin to appreciate the nature of the vegetal sensorium. Why have I never heard of this person? Hold on. I'm writing his name down. Ian Baldwin. Ian Baldwin at Max Planck. Sorry, I'll just find it. Oops. Rather, when he is training his students, he gets them to phytomorphize. According to him, this is the best way for his students to get inside the problems that the plants encounter in their environments. He wants his students to be able to morph their bodies in such a way that they can begin to appreciate the nature of the vegetal sensorium. This means that his students actually have to physicalize vegetal embodiments. I love this. By moving their own bodies to act out plant behaviors and sensing phenomena. It's kind of like those Dance Your PhD contests, he explained, not knowing that I had been researching the Dance Your PhD contest and other body experiments and was writing a book explicitly on the way that scientists move their bodies to help them work out their hypotheses. Another thing I'm interested in. In this remarkable movement, Ian made explicitly the multi-directionality of this mimetic and morphic practice that so readily in other contexts would be rebuked with the charge of anthropomorphism. Like Darwin's body experiments with orchids, phytomorphism is not a trap for Ian and his students. It is a lure. It allows them to vectorize their thinking, pulling and propelling them into new modes of inquiry and new lines of flight. It is the space of these mimetic entanglements among scientists and their plants that it becomes increasingly unclear who is animating what and what is animating whom. These entanglements have a morphic effect, engendering large-scale metamorphoses that change the way that practitioners think and feel about their objects as much as it changes how they think and feel about themselves. What it also set into motion and transformed in this entanglement is the very meaning, the terms used in the analogy. Thus, when researchers talk about plant sensing or plants' capacity for sentience, what these terms signify is also set in motion. Perhaps we could begin to trace an entirely new genealogy of sense, sensibility, and sentience if we were to initiate the inquiry among the plants. Coda. Sitting across from Stacey Harmer in her office, I was treated to an enchanting stories about anticipatory behavior in sunflowers, where her students used scare quotes around every mention of the concept like plant knowing or doing something. Stacey just told me stories she found fascinating. Sitting at her computer, so poor students, they're just afraid. Sitting at her computer in her office, she showed me a time-lapse video produced by Roger Hangarter, a plant scientist at Indiana University. I was familiar with his work and demonstrates some of the incredible ways that plants move their bodies. She explains that she got the idea for working on this program on sunflowers from him. So this is a sunflower plant in Roger's backyard. So it is tracking the sun, and it really moves. The leaves are fairly perpendicular to the sun. The apex is as well. And the sun sets, the leaves in the apex are both going to move towards the west. So this is pretty cool. And then at night, though, it goes back to neutral. And it keeps going. I'm watching the film totally amazed. Roger was able to film with an infrared time-lapse camera through the night, and I could see the plant continuing its movement even as its leaves dropped down to rest for the night. Stacey continues, so this is all before dawn. You can see that the plant, it looks like it is anticipating, right? I'm amazed. It is getting ready for when the sun comes up. Oh, that is so unbelievable. Stunning. So great. Yeah, that is really fascinating to me because the plant is anticipating the direction of dawn, and it is anticipating the timing of dawn. And anticipation is one strong argument for why circadian rhythms evolved. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe we could study sunflower. At no point does Stacey qualify what she means by anticipation. I push her a little. Now, anticipation suggests some kind of memory. And these are very human words. I love the idea that we can redefine them from the plant perspective. So how do you understand memory? She doesn't shy away from my invitation to explore such aspects of plant sensing. Rather, she responds with another remarkable story. Stacey, I'll just mention this. We didn't do this experiment, but it is in the literature. You can take a plant in a pot in the field, and it's nighttime, and it's facing west. And you can go in and manually rotate it 180 degrees so it's facing east. And in the morning, it's facing west because it remembers that it is where the sun should come up. Natasha, you can mess with it and it still knows. Yes. You can mess with it? Yeah. And so when you move this plant to a growth chamber with constant light, you can see that the motion continues for a number of days, though the amplitude is lower. You could argue that it is remembering the direction and the timing of the light conditions. Yeah, so it is really a good question. She tells me how her lab is trying to bring this sunflower experiment indoors into controlled conditions. We can do this in a growth chamber too. So I just wanted for the record that all these people are talking about the amazing things that plants do. And this is where I think we have a break and in a series of plant blindness. If I was to take a human being who wakes up with the sun, like a farmer, and goes to sleep when the sun goes down, and choose to just pick him up and put him in a chamber and change his lights without talking to him or asking him or doing anything, it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen, right? We'd have to have consent and have some kind of ethical conversation. But we do this to plants all the freaking time. So I think ethical discussions are going to be the new frontier of what is ethically acceptable. Just as if we're having this on animal experiments, when is it ethically acceptable? And this goes to so many topics. And these are the hard topics that I know we have in NCC that we need to keep having because I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer, right? When we talk about food, when we talk about furniture, there are no ethical considerations being put in here. And I don't even know what those look like for animal or for human. I don't know. But I know that we need to start asking them because if we're going to move into a new paradigm, the ethical considerations have to be one of the first things we talk about. Back to our regularly scheduled program because we're about to finish. So we've got LED lights turned on sequentially to mimic the sun moving. And we have a camera that can monitor the plant and then infrared lights so we can take pictures even in the dark. And you can see that even during the dark period, the plant is reorienting. So that is nice. It is that anticipation again. And that works nicely when the light dark cycle is 24 hours. But we know for plants and animals that our clocks can't be entrained to non-24-hour cycles, or they are very different. So we did this to our plants. We ran the experiment on a 32-hour cycle, which is very non-natural. But now you can see that at night, it just sits there. It doesn't do anything. But that the same plant, when we reprogram the lights, it spends a couple of days, I would say, learning, being entrained by the new cycle, but then you see that anticipatory again. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. Is it learning? I mean, it doesn't have a brain, obviously. I don't think it is thinking about anything. How do you know? You don't know. You don't know. At the very end of the interview, Stacy qualifies this comment. We seem to feel that if things don't have a brain, then they can't be intelligent. Thank you for having this thought. But of course, anything that survives is intelligent in some ways, I interject. It's figured something out. Stacy agrees and adds, they just don't reason things out the way we do. How do you know? Just because the plant doesn't talk to you about its reasoning process does not mean that it's not happening. I'm not saying it's happening. That's not my point. My point is, you have no freaking way of knowing. And if you talk to plant communicators, you might learn a thing or two. I think back to my conversation with Melissa. Perhaps thinking and reasoning are overrated. Perhaps there are things that plants can do that we can yet barely imagine. I respond, well, maybe they don't need to, right? Stacy agrees. They don't need to. Stacy homes her attention on the molecular mechanism of plant sensing. Her rendering, however, is not disenchanted. Plants, in Stacy's account, don't reason, but they certainly have know-how. How the hell do you think they got there? I wish sometimes we would make these scientists sit there and just walk through the logic of their own thinking right now. I wonder they would realize the blindness. What do you think? Is that possible? Sorry, some creature just showed up in my house. So that's where I was. Sorry. They have the wherewithal to anticipate. They can learn and they can remember. I hear her as suggesting that plants are up to stuff, that they have this kind of agency, a kind of intentionality, and their own way of getting interested and involved in the thicket of entanglements that constitute their multi-species ecologies. She does not seem concerned about anthropomorphism in her storytelling. Of course not, because to her, they're still not really thinking. She does not police her use of language concepts to talk about plants. She's interested in how plants do the things they do, and she uses available concepts to communicate her insights. These concepts are lures for Stacy, and yet it is by bringing these concepts to bear on plant sensory phenomenon that she is simultaneously changing the very meaning of these terms. In this sense, it could be said that she is vegetalizing the concept of memory, anticipation, and learning. I can't help but wonder, what might happen if we were to germinate and grow these concepts from studies on plant sensing? What difference might a vegetal epistemology make to these otherwise human terms? There are so many things to think about in this. So many things. So many things. I don't know about you, but I totally enjoyed this. I mean, I hate the title because I feel like she sold herself short on the title. I think with a better title would have gotten more traction. And I think this is exactly the kind of paper, the kind of conversations that we need to have at a much wider, yeah. I really do hope more members in NCC, like more Sprouts, will watch this, because I feel like this has so many different points of really what is the value of anthropomorphizing is one of them, which I feel like is really important. What is that value, and is there a value of anthropomorphization, which I feel like is super interesting based on what she says. And also going to her like last question is, when we look at things with the vegetalization, and where do we get when we give ourselves permission to embody a vegetalization? So yeah, I think we're getting close to another I Am Plant with new concepts in there. Writing myself a note. Hold on for a second. Yeah, this is going to be exciting. Okay. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I will have the recording up as soon as possible. It will be part of the 2-part series, so I'll put it all together. And yeah, I just really want to hear your thoughts. I mean, I think this is a powerful one. This is a really interesting paper. Thank you for those of you that stayed all the way through to the end. Next week, we will not be having live plant consciousness commentary because we have the final discussion of our Plant Wisdom Book Club book selection number 15, I believe, The Underland. So we will be having that discussion. You're more than welcome. It's in Seedling Sprouts. You're more than welcome to come and join us, even if you haven't read the book. It's, just come and listen, and every once in a while something really great comes up. This third section is very different from the others, in my opinion. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and to the overall, how does this fit into our Plant Wisdom series? We're also voting on our next book, so head on over to the Plant Wisdom Book Club and put your vote in, because we want to see what you have. This is the preliminary voting, so we'll break it down. We'll narrow it down to the top 5, and then next week we will vote on our final selection. We have lots of stuff coming up in the Naturally Conscious community. I mean, we just did our Befriend Your Limiting Beliefs webinar, as I mentioned at the beginning. So if you have not participated in that, feel free to go and listen to the recording. We are set up for another Kickstart Your Conscious Revolution, the 5th through the 9th of February. And we are still having conversations about the Mystery School. I will be producing information for everybody very, very soon. There's just lots of other stuff that's going on. There's our Creative Greenhouse coming up next week, our NCLG mentorship call. We have our writing time, which is evolving in new ways. I mean, seriously, there's so much going on. So if you go over to Events for You, you will see a listing of all of the live events. Obviously, in Sprout discussions, there's always a running commentary of amazing kind of thought-provoking conversations, and I do hope that you will participate in them. If you have any questions at all about our community, about our ecosystem, about what we're doing here, and you don't feel comfortable yet to post it live, feel free to just send me a message. So we will be seeing each other again in 2 weeks for the next paper. I'm running down my list, which is huge, and hopefully they'll all be as amazing as the one we just did today. And I look forward to your feedback, your comments, your thoughts, your ideas. But until then, remember to resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. This is Tigria Gardenia. I'm off. Bye.